The new funding comes after a First Nations discovery last month of what is believed to be the remains of 215 people on the grounds of a residential school in British Columbia. Ontario's Minister of Indigenous Affairs, Greg Rickford, joins me now. Minister Rickford, thank you very much for taking the time to join the program today. And I want to ask you about the amount, $10 million. That's what you've come up with for this effort. How did you come up with that amount, and what consultation did you do with Indigenous leaders?
Oh, thank you for that. It's great to be here today. Very carefully, we had taken a look at what the federal commitment was, the preliminary commitment, the pressures on it. We thought that it was going to significantly underserve the kind of work that needed to be done here. Ontario had 18 residential schools. There's no precise science, but we allocated $10 million, which is very front end and immediately available for the mental health and wellness supports, which will deal with some of the traumatic, impactful beginnings of some of the activities that will now take place. Mm-hmm. And of course, to have an appropriate resource available for the kind of technologies that will support the identification, the investigation, and protection, and then ultimately the commemoration. I should say, David, finally, that obviously we've left this open in some respects, to the extent that by putting it into phases, we believe we'll be able to respond if and when there's more findings from the Indigenous-led process. Very concerned, obviously, with the federal government's commitment at this point. And
what do you mean by that? What do you mean by you're concerned?
Well, we're not sure that $27 million will serve the Indigenous peoples across this country, given the pressures already of applications. I don't have all of the numbers in, but from what I understand, there are a number of applications already bearing down on that $27 million. And we felt very strongly that the Indigenous people, their survivors, their communities, the organizations who've already started many of these kinds of activities, similar to the leadership in Kamloops, would need further support than what was being offered by the federal government.
And why did it take the revelation by the Kamloops Tshwekmek First Nation about what they have found? Why did it take that for you to take action?
Well, listen, first and foremost, obviously an important question, the legacy of these 215 children, and to the extent that there are more here in Ontario, needs to be accounted for. That said, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as a report, as it was released not too long ago, Ontario has already begun the work that the recommendations 71 through 77 asked us to. They're pertinent to burial sites. And so we began the process of working on saving and digitizing archival records, locating death records of residential school students, and working to reclaim Indigenous names and other things like waiving name change fees for residential school survivors. So we believe that that a certain amount of work had been done. This obviously creates a sense of urgency to it, to the extent that there are known, unknown, or unmarked burial grounds at or around Indian residential schools, as they were referred to. Ontario has to act, and what we've announced today under the leadership of our Premier, as you heard him today, I think accomplishes just that.
Minister, I'd like to ask you, because we are once again as Canadians taking a look at the legacy of residential schools, and one of the many considerations out there right now is happening right in downtown Toronto. Ryerson University, the namesake Edgerton Ryerson, one of the architects of the residential school system. There is a movement, not just from within some of the faculty of that university, but more broadly, certainly among some students, to rename that university. We saw everything with the statue being taken down there, but that is part of a broader movement to perhaps rename it. Some faculty are already calling it X University. I wonder where you, as Minister of Indigenous Affairs at the provincial level, stand on that debate about whether Ryerson should be renamed.
Look, I think the cancel culture has problems. I think it's more about accountability, and that's exactly what this announcement for us endeavors to do. The fact of the matter is that, as my understanding similarly, that there was a call for Canada's first Prime Minister. Well, what about all of the rest that followed? The Indian Residential School marks the history of most of the time that Canada has been a country. That's the darkest chapter of our history, and I think that we should focus on survivors, their communities, the organizations who've been doing work as a signatory to the Indian Residential School Agreement in the first instance, and then moving forward in various capacities as a nurse, lawyer, and now a politician working in this space. My responsibility is to the survivors, their brothers and sisters, and the families who are still mourning for the remains of children who never came back from school. That's what our priority is. That's what we announced today, and that's what we're going to move forward with.
And so what would you say, because you say your focus is on survivors and their families, what would you say to the family member who is a student at Ryerson who at some point will go through those doors on an institution named after someone who helped design the residential school system and is, certainly there is, I recognize a lot of debate around this, but there is a constituency of people who would like to see that particular school renamed. What would you say to someone who advocates that kind of a position?
Look, my focus is on supporting the students of Indian Residential School Agreement, Indian Residential Schools. I'm focused squarely on making sure that survivors, their families, and their communities have a chance to recover those remains, mourn in an appropriate way, an expectation every single one of us has, speaking as a father of 2 school-age children. And to the extent that descendant of a survivor was to enter the doors of a college or a university that had some kind of tie to Indian residential school agreements, that they would have sufficiently healed to understand the complexities of Canadian history, how we got here, and how we can constantly strive to do better. That's all that the only role that I can play in this, David.
And then briefly, Minister, just on the announcement that you're making today, the timelines, you note the potential recovery of undocumented remains. Certainly that will be up to the First Nations and the families in question. I recognize that it's not a decision by your government about what to do with the remains once they're found. But what is the timeline on locating them? What briefly is the timeline?
Yeah, that's the important matter that we discussed with Indigenous leaders, and in the design of our program, we will put an Indigenous-led leadership group together for this, or they will. That some of those preliminary discussions have already begun in an effort to understand this. 3 years, we think, is, especially with a significant amount of the resources committed to the first phases of identification, for example, and understanding where other unmarked graves may be, should happen as quickly as possible. And at the end of 3 years, we'll assess what further work needs to be done, but we're hopeful by then, and by all accounts, we've heard from Indigenous leadership across the country today since making the announcement, that 3 years is a fair and reasonable timeline. We're prepared to do more work should it be. My promise, and the promise of our Premier, was that we would have the backs of Indian residential school survivors, their families, and their communities, and in particular for the lives of the children who never came back from their school.
Minister Rickford, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.